And it's time for our news segment once again on episode 2. Tall, welcome back.
Yeah, it's great to be back. We're trying a few new things out, and I feel a lot more comfortable doing this. And I think we're gonna, work with the segments a little bit. So it's really nice to be back. And every time we do them, it seems like a year's worth of events happen between each segment. It's only been a few weeks.
We got a lot going on in the world. The Ukraine situation has changed. Obviously, we want to talk about that. We want to talk about Iraq because things are developing there. Kurds are gaining more power, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And some more things are going on with ISIS. What part of the world do you want to start with? What is just on the tip of your tongue?
Yeah, sure. No, the one I've been thinking a lot about, of course, is the Ukraine. I was a European history major and focused on Central and Eastern Europe. So all the stuff that's sort of been cascading right now is in my wheelhouse, as they say. The situation in Europe and the world generally is sort of a lot like World War I, and then of course the post-world order after World War I was very unstable, and people were sort of feeling their way forward because an entire era had been disruptive. And so I was thinking a lot about this because one of the things that happened after World War I is essentially the Soviet Union was out of the alliance system. The original Triple Alliance in World War I was France, Britain, and Russia. And then when Russia dropped out of the war for signing a treaty, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty with Germany, they were effectively out of the war. And then the Soviets, of course, had to fight Russian civil war, so they were out of the alliance system. And then France, of course, was so afraid of a new war with Germany that it sought to undermine and try to seek other alliances. And one of the alliances it picked up on, which is quite interesting, is it's called the Little Entente, which was basically the new state of Czechoslovakia, which was carved out of Austria-Hungary, worked with what became with Yugoslavia and then Romania in order to sort of guarantee against historic Hungarian revisionism. People don't know that Hungary actually controlled
they
quite
were really
a lot.
Powerful.
Austria-Hungary
really
was a dual monarchy, and they controlled a lot of the Balkans and Eastern Europe. And after that, basically the Treaty of Trianon essentially carved up Hungary, so it was reduced to what it was now. With Slovakia got put into Czechoslovakia became a country, Transylvania, and a lot of parts became part of Romania.
Right, because they weren't protecting themselves against Russia; they were protecting themselves against Hungary.
Originally, which was ironic, they were exactly, and also they were protecting themselves against Hungary, and then of course Yugoslavia, Serbia was again to keep the Hungarians from accepting the Habsburg monarchy, which wasn't going to happen. But the interesting thing was that was sort of the response, and then France tried to parlay that and say, well, we've already got this system here going on. Why don't we use that to sort of as a counterweight to Germany? And the reason that's relevant, and I know this is sort of
no, I was just going to ask you. So how do you relate
this
that
is
situation?
relevant to the Ukrainian situation.
Who are the players
now?
And what is this analogy?
Because so Poland would sort of be like France and essentially trying to insulate itself from Russia by trying to push NATO to further action. NATO, of course, is divided because of its trade relations with Russia.
Well, Ukraine isn't in NATO.
No, that's right. Ukraine isn't in NATO, so there is no treaty obligation to defend Ukraine, but Poland, just like France, Poland's idea is that, well, if we just allow Ukraine to fall, they don't necessarily trust NATO to actually stand up against Russia, even though, of course, we would be obliged to do so. But also they're concerned not only with their own fate, but also the fate of the Baltic republics, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and of course, Moldova in the south with Transnistria, which is another bordering the Ukraine as well, is another breakaway province that the Russians could use as an excuse to put pressure on Moldova. So the way
these are all really, really tiny countries.
These are small, and in some sense they're not significant, but they are. But certainly the Baltics are in NATO, which a lot of people debate whether or not that's even viable to defend them. Poland's in NATO, and East Germany, even if it's integrated, Germany won't be allowed to be in NATO, or if it is, then you won't go further past Germany, aka Poland, the rest of Eastern Europe would not be in NATO. And now, of course, all of those countries are now in NATO.
Right.
So Russia feels sort of like we kind of gave them a raw deal there. And ironically, and even though Ukraine isn't in NATO, we did have, in order for them to give up their nuclear weapons, they signed a treaty in '94. So it's called the Budapest Memorandum.
Okay.
And
Budapest was involved, right?
Yeah, no, Budapest is in Hungary, but that's where they signed it. It's Russia, Ukraine, Britain and America, and then was sort of like, okay, we're all going to economically support their, them becoming their own independent nation, and also, their territorial integrity, which included the Crimea at the time, which, if I were Russia at the time, I would not have agreed to that because that was going to bring conflict, but they agreed to it. And the East, the situation with the East was settled, and in exchange, of course, Ukraine would basically
Give up their nuclear
give up
weapons.
the nuclear weapons. They would all be
Nuclear program.
dismantled
Right.
and taken to Russia, and then they also divided the Black Sea Fleet as well, was divided up.
And that's how Russia was able to keep a
Right, and
military base in Crimea.
and Russia was able to keep their fleet, in Sevastopol. Their treaty has been broken, and
But no one's backing them up.
no one's backing.
These four powers.
Yeah.
that
Britain
signed
and
the
the
treaty.
U.S. are obligated to
Shame
to
on you
support
guys.
it. But what recently changed the equation is the Ukrainian president and Vladimir Putin. They met in Belarus, and they basically, everybody sort of has an idea of what a deal might look like. It might be greater autonomy for the two regions in questions, for the Russian language, and maybe some different economic provisos, and maybe Russia was trying to keep Ukraine out of NATO, which actually might fail even if Russia wins. That actually is likely to fail. Ukraine will attempt to get in NATO. Whether or not NATO will let them in is another matter. But what ended up happening is while they were discussing this, the Ukrainians were trying to basically break the Russian separatists and actually come to the negotiating table with a stronger hand. And of course Putin wanted the Russian separatists to continue to do well in order to survive and do well in order to put more pressure for a final treaty with the Ukrainians. So what ended up happening is the Russians slipped in a fairly sizable force. We have satellite pictures
During the peace talks.
Yeah, during the peace talks, sort of, on and off, and they denied, of course, but that's what's basically happened. And what ended up happening is essentially the Ukrainian front line collapsed. And so the way that this leads back to the initial thing I was talking about is sort of what I suspect will happen is Obama's going to the Baltics to reassure them on security, but what I suspect will be a side meeting is the Baltic countries, in conjunction with Poland and Ukraine, are going to try to find a way to send aid to the Ukrainians. The other thing that's happening is people don't realize Russian citizens are dying in the Ukraine right now,
Yeah.
and it's going to be interesting to see is how many the Russian media, of course, is not reporting it, but they're definitely body bags. Sort of reminds me like when we invaded Iraq, so the policies changed so that the journalists couldn't film the body bags coming back, and this is a huge issue. And I think it's going to be, the longer this goes on, actually, it's going to start becoming unpopular in Russia itself, depending on how many bodies come back.
And thank you again for listening to the World News and Current Events with Tal Greenberg. You're watching the Sam Jack Podcast. I'm not a professional, but wait, I am. We'll be right back.